A very warm welcome to the Economic and Management Sciences pupils. In this lesson, we will discuss the topic called the factors of production, very specifically the capital factor. Let's go into our slides that displays the table of contents. On our first slide, called the table of contents, our introduction entails what is an input and what is an output. We will then do a brief overview of the four factors of production. During the development phase, we will discuss what is capital, capital goods, as well as the sources of capital, either own capital or borrowed capital. Thereafter, we will conclude the lesson with an activity. If we go to the next slide, the introduction slide, I would like to begin this topic by posing a question to stimulate critical thinking. What is an input and what is an output? Inputs are resources used in the production process to produce outputs such as finished goods and services. Inputs are the four factors of production such as capital, labor, entrepreneurship, and natural resources. Businesses combine these four inputs to produce goods and services. Our goods and services are our outputs. The diagram below shows the factors of production and an explanation of each. The first factor that's depicted in the diagram is land, which is your natural resources. Natural resources are available for production. In return for having land or letting out land on rent, you receive a rental income. The next factor, called labor. Any person that works in any place of employment will receive a wages or salary in return for the work that is done. The next factor, called enterprise, also known as entrepreneurship. A person organizes the factors of production and takes risks. He or she starts a business and he is known as an entrepreneur. In return for taking those risks, he receives a profit if the business is successful. The last factor on the diagram is capital. If you invest capital into a business, you will receive interest on that capital. Capital is money that is invested in a business. If we move on to the development phase, which is the next slide, okay. If you wanted to start a business, how would you finance this business? You would obviously need money, and as I said in the slide before, money that's invested in a business is called capital. So a description is given on the slide. Capital is the money the owner invested in the business from savings or borrowed money. The owner can invest capital in capital goods such as machines, buildings, equipment, and vehicles that are used to produce other goods and services. This basically means that the owner does not have to just invest capital. He can also invest assets into the business. And these assets, which are your machinery, buildings, and equipment, are called capital goods. An example is given. The sewing machines that are used in certain factories to make clothes such as t-shirts are called capital goods. If we move on to the next slide on capital goods, it says Capital does not only include money, it's manufactured resources. Example, machinery, tools, buildings. These are all called capital goods. And capital goods are needed to produce other goods and services. An example of capital goods that's depicted in the diagram. Tools are being used in the diagram to manufacture a stool, which will in return be sold at a supermarket. The next slide depicts the sources of capital. A business can get capital from two main sources, either own capital or borrowed capital. Own capital. Own capital is the money that the entrepreneur and possibly his or her family is prepared to put into the business. This may not necessarily be money, but can also take the form of assets, as we've already explained in the previous slides. Borrowed capital. The entrepreneur could borrow money in the form of a loan from any of the major banks or from friends or family. This is called borrowed capital. The entrepreneur will have to repay this loan normally within a period of 1 to 5 years, depending on where the money is borrowed from. There will also be an expense called interest expense for the money that was borrowed that needs to be repaid to any financial institution. If we go on to our last slide called conclusion, I would like you to reflect on what you have learned in this lesson. We focused on 3 areas of capital. Capital goods, which we've said was goods that are used to manufacture other goods. Then we focused on what is own capital and borrowed capital. To conclude this lesson, I would like you to write a paragraph on your understanding of the first factor of production, which is called capital. The paragraph should be about 100 words in length. My initial activity for the lesson was the think, pair, share strategy. Each learner was supposed to either choose own capital or borrowed capital, study the content on it, and then teach his peer. But due to the pandemic, this is not possible. Therefore, I chose the activity that you have today on the paragraph of the on the factor of production called capital. And this concludes our lesson for today. Have a good day.